In the autumn of 1187, a general stood outside the walls of Jerusalem and offered the city's defenders terms so generous that his own lieutenants thought he had lost his mind. No massacre, no enslavement, safe passage for every soul who could pay a modest ransom, and for the thousands who could not, he paid it himself. His enemies called him the most dangerous man in the world, and then, in the same breath, the most honorable. His name was Saladin, and within a generation of his death, the world had turned him into something close to a myth. The noble adversary, the merciful conqueror, the man who proved that even war had room for grace. But the mercy was the ending. Before Saladin stood outside Jerusalem, he had spent 2 decades fighting wars that no legend bothered to remember. Wars against other Muslims, against rival princes, against a Shia caliphate that had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, against Zengid warlords who had no interest in unity and every interest in survival. He had to build a state before he could fight a crusade. He had to break the Islamic world apart before he could put it back together on his own terms. The legend came last. Everything before it was harder, messier, and far more consequential. And almost nobody talks about it. In the middle of the 12th century, the Islamic world was not a world. It was a collection of competing powers bound together by a shared faith and divided by almost everything else. Dynasty, ethnicity, doctrine, and the particular ambitions of men who had inherited thrones they were not willing to share. There was no single caliph with real authority. There was no unified army. There was no political center. There was only a fracture line running from Egypt to Iraq, and a dozen princes standing on either side of it, watching each other. The oldest fault line was doctrinal. Sunni Islam recognized the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad as the legitimate seat of Islamic authority. A caliphate that had once commanded an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia, and now commanded in the 1100s very little beyond the city it sat in. The caliph still issued decrees. He still conferred legitimacy on rulers who sought it, but real power had long since drained away to the military strongmen, the sultans and atabegs, who governed in his name and ignored his instructions. The rival claim came from Cairo. The Fatimid Caliphate had ruled Egypt since 969, and it ruled it as a Shia institution, a direct challenge to the Abbasid order, a competing center of Islamic legitimacy, and a state that controlled the wealthiest province in the medieval world. The Nile made Egypt rich. The grain harvest fed populations from the Mediterranean coast to the Hejaz. Whoever held Egypt held a resource base that no rival in the region could easily match, and the Fatimids had held it for 2 centuries. By the 1140s and 1150s, the Fatimid state was in the process of destroying itself. The caliphs had become ceremonial figures, real power passing to a succession of viziers who fought one another for control of the palace and the treasury. The army was fractured into competing factions, Sudanese regiments against Turkish cavalry against Berber infantry, each loyal to a different patron and willing to turn on the others when the politics required it. The state still stood, but the machinery inside it had been grinding against itself for a generation. North of Egypt, Syria was a different kind of disorder. The region had been carved into city-states, Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, each governed by a Turkish or Kurdish lord who had emerged from the wreckage of the Seljuk Empire. The Seljuks had swept out of Central Asia in the 11th century, overwhelmed the Abbasid Caliphate, and built an empire that ran from Anatolia to Persia. Then they had done what every great conquest dynasty eventually did. They had allowed their sons to divide it, and the divisions had multiplied until the empire was a memory and the successor states were fighting over its remains. The dominant power in Syria by the 1150s was the Zengid dynasty, founded by Imad ad-Din Zengi, and centered on Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi himself had been a genuine military force, the man who retook Edessa from the Crusaders in 1144, the first significant loss the Crusader states had suffered since their founding. But Zengi was dead by 1146, and the empire he had built was already dividing between his sons. Nur ad-Din held Aleppo. His brother held Mosul. Between them, there was respect, occasional cooperation, and a permanent competition, neither of them fully resolved. Nur ad-Din Mahmud was not simply a warlord. He understood something about the age he lived in that his rivals did not fully grasp, that the Crusader states could not be expelled by military force alone. They could only be expelled if the Islamic world surrounding them first achieved a level of political unity it had never previously managed. He preached jihad not only as a religious obligation, but as a political program, a framework for demanding that rival Muslim princes subordinate their local interests to a shared external enemy. It was a powerful idea. It would take someone else to execute it. The Crusader states themselves had been sitting in the Levant since 1099. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, which, by the 1150s, was already gone. They were colonial entities built on military conquest and held in place by the constant arrival of reinforcements from Europe. They had walls, supply lines, and ports. They had an intimate knowledge of local geography. They also had a political culture prone to internal faction, a relentless argument about who held ultimate authority, and a dependency on the sea routes connecting them to France and England that made them permanently vulnerable if those routes were ever interrupted. The relationship between the Crusader states and their Muslim neighbors was not a continuous war. For long stretches, it was something more complicated, a system of truces, commercial arrangements, and tactical alliances in which a Muslim prince would sooner cooperate with a Frankish lord against a Muslim rival than sacrifice his own position for the sake of religious solidarity. Damascus had allied with Jerusalem against Zengi. Aleppo had looked for Frankish support when Nur ad-Din pressed too hard. The ideological framework of crusade and jihad existed, and both sides could activate it when they needed to. But the daily reality of the Levant operated on interests, not ideas. Into this world, two groups of people had almost no voice. The Arab populations of Syria and Palestine, the farmers, the artisans, the scholars of the provincial madrasas, lived under Turkish and Kurdish military aristocracies that treated them as a subject population and a tax base. They were Sunni, mostly, which meant they shared a doctrinal identity with their rulers, but shared nothing of their political power. Their world was defined by who controlled the granary and who commanded the garrison, not by what happened in the throne rooms of Aleppo or Cairo. The Kurdish people occupied a particular position in this landscape. They were soldiers, primarily. The Kurdish tribal confederations had been supplying military manpower to the Islamic world for centuries. They were Sunni, orthodox, and politically flexible in the sense that they served whoever paid and promoted them. They had produced capable commanders. They had not produced a dynasty. The family that would change that had already made its way into the Zengid military structure by the 1140s. A Kurdish officer named Najm ad-Din Ayyub and his brother Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, both men of ability, both men in service to a power that would eventually be displaced by their own bloodline. This was the world waiting for what came next. A Shia caliphate rotting from within, a Sunni caliphate stripped of power, a Syrian patchwork of competing Turkish princes held loosely together by a shared ideology nobody had yet found the military means to act on. A string of Crusader cities along the Mediterranean coast, well defended and internally divided. And somewhere inside the Zengid military apparatus, a Kurdish family learning the mechanisms of power in a world that had not yet decided who would eventually hold it. Saladin was born in Tikrit, in what is now northern Iraq, probably in 1138. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was the garrison commander of the town, a Kurdish officer in service to the Zengid military machine, a man of practical competence and careful political instincts who understood that advancement in this world came from attaching yourself to the right patron at the right moment and never making an enemy you could not afford. The family left Tikrit the same night Saladin was born. His uncle Shirkuh had killed a man, and the safest thing to do was go. They went to Mosul and then, eventually, to Damascus. Zengi rewarded the family for their loyalty. Ayyub was given the governorship of Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, and the family settled there before moving eventually to Damascus, after Ayyub and Shirkuh negotiated its surrender to Nur ad-Din in 1154. Damascus was the most cosmopolitan city in the Islamic Levant, a place of markets, scholars, and competing interests where Zengid authorities sat uneasily over a population that had its own commercial relationships with the Frankish coast and its own ideas about who should govern it. Ayyub served its new governor with the same careful loyalty he had shown everywhere else. He rose steadily. He made himself useful. He raised his sons inside a world where power was something you studied, not something you inherited, where you watched how alliances formed and dissolved, how patronage worked, how a man with no dynastic claim built authority from the ground up through service, reputation, and the careful accumulation of obligation. Saladin grew up inside this education without knowing it was one. He studied the Quran, the religious sciences, and the adab literature that formed the intellectual culture of the Islamic ruling class, the poetry, the political philosophy, the art of correspondence that allowed a commander to project authority through the written word as much as through the battlefield. He was literate in a world where many soldiers were not. He understood doctrine in a world where doctrine was a political instrument. These were not incidental accomplishments. They were the specific tools the adult Saladin would reach for again and again. The military formation came through his uncle. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh was a Zengid commander of growing reputation, a physically imposing, strategically aggressive officer who had earned Nur ad-Din's trust through a sequence of difficult campaigns. Shirkuh took his nephew into his household and into his army. The relationship was formative in a way that went beyond tactics. Shirkuh operated with a particular combination of boldness and calculation. He moved fast, he committed fully, and he was never confused about the difference between a battle and a war. Saladin watched this and absorbed it. Nur ad-Din himself was the larger classroom. Saladin spent his formative years inside the Zengid court at Damascus and Aleppo, watching one of the most capable rulers of the age manage the impossible problem of holding a fragmented principality together through a combination of military force, religious legitimacy, and relentless personal attention to the loyalty of his officers. Nur ad-Din used the ideology of Sunni revival not as mere rhetoric, but as a genuine governing program, building madrasas, appointing orthodox judges, cultivating the ulama, and framing every military campaign as a contribution to the defense of the faith. Saladin was watching a template being assembled. What Saladin also watched, just as carefully, was where the template failed. Nur ad-Din was a demanding patron. Suspicious of subordinates who grew too powerful, reluctant to delegate authority he could not recover, and prone to interpreting independent success as the first step toward betrayal. He had broken officers who became rivals. He had constrained commanders whose victories threatened to exceed his own. The lesson was double-edged. The ideology of jihad was an extraordinarily effective tool for building coalition, but it required a center that was secure enough not to fear the coalition it had assembled. Nur ad-Din was never fully secure. Saladin filed that observation away. By his late 20s, Saladin was a competent officer in a system that rewarded competence carefully and promoted it slowly. He had served in campaigns. He had administered a small territory. He had learned the fiscal mechanics of the Iqta system, the land grants that the Zengids used to pay their military officers by assigning them the tax revenues of a district rather than a salary. He understood that an army was not a military instrument alone, but an economic one. That soldiers stayed loyal when the revenues flowed and drifted when they did not, and that controlling territory meant controlling the money that kept men in the field. There is a story, repeated in several sources, that Saladin seriously considered leaving military life for religious study. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it reveals, that the adults around him recognized in him a quality of mind that was not primarily martial. He was thoughtful in a way that made people around him uneasy, not because he was weak, but because he was always thinking about something further ahead than the immediate campaign. He was also, by every account, personally compelling, the kind of man who generated loyalty not through fear, but through the specific quality of attention he gave to the people around him. The appointment that changed everything came in 1163, when Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh to intervene in the Egyptian succession crisis. And Shirkuh brought Saladin with him. The Fatimid vizier Shawar had been expelled from Cairo by a rival named Durgam and had appealed to Nur ad-Din for military support, offering territorial concessions in return. Nur ad-Din saw the opportunity for what it was, a chance to extend Zengid influence into Egypt, the wealthiest province in the region, under the legal cover of answering a legitimate appeal. Shirkuh saw a campaign. Saladin, in his mid-20s and subordinate in everything, went along and watched. The Egyptian intervention stretched across 3 separate expeditions between 1164 and 1169. Shawar, restored to power with Zengid help, immediately began negotiating with the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem for protection against the very force that had restored him. The strategic geometry was extraordinary. A Muslim vizier allied with Frankish Crusaders against a Muslim general acting in the name of a Muslim sultan. Saladin fought in these campaigns, held positions under siege, maneuvered against Frankish forces, and watched his uncle navigate the difference between what the military situation required and what the political situation permitted. Shirkuh died in March of 1169, 2 months after finally securing control of Cairo as Fatimid vizier. He had been a great eater all his life, a man who feasted as he campaigned, lavishly and without restraint. A severe bout of quinsy, a throat abscess that his physicians could not arrest, killed him within weeks of reaching the summit he had spent a decade climbing. The Fatimid Caliphate, calculating that Saladin was younger and therefore more manageable than any of the other Zengid officers available, appointed him to replace his uncle. It was the kind of miscalculation that changes history. Saladin was 31 years old. He now controlled the administrative apparatus of the wealthiest state in the Islamic world. He had learned everything he needed to learn. The question was whether he would use it for Nur ad-Din or for himself. Saladin entered Cairo not as a conqueror, but as a servant. That distinction mattered enormously to the Fatimid court, which needed to believe it was still in control, to Nur ad-Din in Damascus, who needed to believe his officer remained his subordinate, and to the population of Egypt, which had lived under Shia Fatimid rule for 2 centuries and had no particular appetite for a violent rupture. Saladin understood all 3 audiences simultaneously. He behaved in the first months of his vizierate like a man who had no agenda beyond the one he had been sent to execute. The Fatimid Caliphate he now administered from the inside was a state built on ceremony. The Caliph al-Adid was young, politically inexperienced, and surrounded by a court whose elaborate ritual life had long since become a substitute for actual governance. The Friday sermon in Cairo's mosques, the khutbah, was still delivered in the Shia form, invoking the Fatimid Caliph as the legitimate commander of the faithful. The judicial system operated under Shia jurisprudence. The army still contained the ethnic factions, Sudanese, Armenian, Berber, that had been loyal to Fatimid patronage networks for generations. Saladin left all of this formally intact and began dismantling it from beneath. The first instrument was personnel. Saladin replaced Fatimid officials in key administrative positions with men he trusted, Sunnis mostly, drawn from the network of Kurdish and Syrian officers he had brought with him from the Zengid world. He did this slowly enough that no single appointment looked like a purge, and quickly enough that within 2 years, the actual machinery of Egyptian government was running through men who answered to him rather than to the palace. The caliph still issued proclamations. The proclamations were now drafted by people Saladin had appointed. The second instrument was the army. The Fatimid military had 3 main components, and Saladin moved against each of them in sequence. The Sudanese regiments were the most immediately dangerous, large, cohesive, and historically loyal to the Fatimid dynasty. In 1169, they rose against Saladin in a direct confrontation in the streets of Cairo. He defeated them and then burned the quarter of the city where their dependents lived, destroying the social infrastructure that had sustained their military cohesion. It was the clearest act of violence in his Egyptian consolidation, and he committed it without hesitation. The Armenian and Berber units were handled differently, absorbed, dispersed, or allowed to atrophy through the redirection of pay and provisioning toward the new Sunni Turkish and Kurdish regiments Saladin was building in parallel. By 1171, he commanded an Egyptian army that was, in its effective core, his own. The Fatimid military structure still existed on paper. The men who mattered answered to Saladin. The doctrinal shift came next, and it was executed with the same methodical patience. In 1171, Saladin arranged for the Friday khutbah in Cairo to be delivered in the Sunni form, invoking the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad rather than the Fatimid Caliph sitting a few streets away. The change was announced without drama. There was no public confrontation, no declaration of theological war. The sermon simply changed. Most of Cairo's population, which was predominantly Sunni in practice even under Fatimid rule, accepted the change without visible resistance. The Fatimid court registered it as the act of erasure it was and could do nothing about it. Al-Adid, the last Fatimid caliph, died in September of 1171. Of illness, by every account, and there is no compelling evidence that Saladin accelerated his death. He did not need to. He had already ensured that when Al-Adid died, there would be no successor, no institutional continuity, and no power base capable of mounting a restoration. Saladin did not attend the caliph's deathbed. He sent a subordinate. The message was carried in the gesture. The Fatimid Caliphate had ceased to matter before it ceased to exist. The treasury was the prize that made everything else possible. The Fatimid state had accumulated 2 centuries of wealth, textiles, jewelry, manuscripts, gold, the accumulated surplus of the Nile's agricultural output, managed by the most sophisticated fiscal bureaucracy in the medieval Islamic world. Saladin liquidated much of it systematically, not through seizure alone, but through the redistribution of Iqta revenues to his new officer class, the endowment of Sunni madrasas and mosques, and the financing of the military expansion he was already planning. The wealth that had sustained the Fatimid ideological apparatus was now funding its replacement. The madrasa program was not merely religious. Saladin founded or patronized Sunni institutions in Cairo, Alexandria, and the provincial cities. Schools operating under the Shafi'i and Maliki legal traditions that the Egyptian population had quietly maintained even under Fatimid rule. These institutions trained judges, administrators, and preachers who would staff the new order. The ideological infrastructure of Sunni Egypt was built within a decade, and it was built to last in a way that the military changes alone could not guarantee. Nur ad-Din watched all of this from Damascus with growing unease. He had sent Shirkuh to Egypt to extend Zengid influence, not to hand his subordinate the resources of a superpower. He sent increasingly pointed instructions to Saladin, demanding military contributions, demanding the formal acknowledgement of Zengid authority, demanding, in effect, that Saladin remember whose man he was. Saladin answered with letters of loyalty, gifts, and reasons why the specific action requested was not currently possible. He was managing his patron with the same patient indirection he had used on the Fatimid court. The tension between them was never resolved by confrontation. It was resolved, instead, by death. Nur ad-Din died in May of 1174, leaving a son 11 years old, an Assyrian principality that had no mechanism for determining who would govern in the child's name. Saladin received the news in Cairo, where he now controlled the richest state in the Islamic world, commanded an army built entirely from his own appointments, and had spent 5 years constructing the institutional foundations of a power entirely his own. The Zengid succession crisis was not a problem. It was an invitation. He had not called what he did in Egypt a conquest. He had called it administration. He had not called the dismantling of the Fatimid state a revolution. He had called it reform. The language had been careful throughout. The language of a loyal officer executing a mandate, never the language of a man building a personal empire. But the personal empire was exactly what he had built. And everyone with the patience to observe what had actually happened understood it. Egypt was the foundation. Without it, everything that followed was impossible. The army Saladin would use to fight the Crusaders had been financed by Egyptian revenues. The legitimacy he would claim as the defender of Sunni Islam had been established by the suppression of the Fatimid Caliphate. The political model he would apply to Syria, the slow replacement of hostile institutions with loyal ones, the careful management of rival claims, the deployment of ideology as a tool of consolidation, had been rehearsed in full on the Nile. He was ready to go north. Nur ad-Din died on the 15th of May, 1174, in the citadel of Damascus. He was 56 years old. Felled by a fever complicated by a peritonsillar abscess that his physicians could not resolve, he left behind an 11-year-old son, a Syrian principality with no established mechanism of regency, and a network of Turkish and Kurdish officers who had served him loyally for decades and now faced the question of who, exactly, they were loyal to. The answer they gave would determine the shape of the Islamic world for the next generation. The Zengid succession fractured almost immediately. As-Salih, Nur ad-Din's son and heir, was in Damascus when his father died. Within weeks, he had been removed to Aleppo by the eunuch Gumushtigin, who intended to govern in the boy's name and use his custody as a political instrument. The governor of Damascus, Ibn al-Muqaddam, found himself squeezed between Gumushtigin in Aleppo and Saif ad-Din of Mosul, Nur ad-Din's nephew, who was already marching south to claim what he regarded as his family's inheritance. The men who had served the Zengid project were now methodically dismantling it. Ibn al-Muqaddam made a decision that changed everything. Unable to hold Damascus against the combined pressure of Aleppo and Mosul, and unwilling to submit to either, he sent a message south to Egypt. He invited Saladin to come. The invitation was an act of desperation dressed as politics, and Saladin, who had spent 5 years building his Egyptian base precisely for this moment, recognized it for what it was. He left Cairo with 700 picked horsemen and rode north across the desert. He reached Damascus on the 22nd of November, 1174, and entered the city without resistance. The welcome was genuine. The population remembered his father, knew his family, and had no particular desire to become a subsidiary of either Aleppo or Mosul. Saladin distributed money from the treasury to the city's notables, confirmed local officials in their positions, and framed every action he took in the language of service to the legitimate Zengid heir. He was not conquering Damascus, he was protecting it for as-Salih. The language was not deception exactly, it was the specific political vocabulary that the situation required. No Muslim prince in 1174 could openly declare that he was seizing territory that belonged to another Muslim ruler. The ideological framework Nur ad-Din had built, the framework in which all Muslim political energy was supposed to orient itself toward the expulsion of the Franks, made naked aggression against a co-religionist illegitimate in a way it had not been before. Saladin had absorbed this lesson perfectly. He moved as a protector. He governed as a sovereign. Aleppo refused to accept the fiction. Gumushtigin had a Salih physically present in the city, and he deployed the boy with considerable skill, parading him through the streets, appealing to the loyalty Nur ad-Din's veterans felt for their dead master's son, and framing Saladin's arrival not as protection, but as usurpation. The population of Aleppo, unlike Damascus, was not yet ready to transfer its loyalty. When Saladin besieged the city on the 30th of December, 1174, the walls held. As-Salih came out of the palace and wept before the defenders. The city did not fall. Gumushtigin reached further. He negotiated with the Order of Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili movement based in the Syrian mountains, whose leadership had already marked Saladin as an enemy for destroying the Fatimid order they regarded as their spiritual predecessor. In January of 1175, a group of assassins entered Saladin's camp and came within reach of his tent before being stopped. It was the first of several attempts on his life. He survived each of them, and each time he survived, his reputation for something close to divine protection grew slightly larger in the minds of the men around him. The military confrontation Aleppo had sought came in April of 1175 at the Horns of Hama, 2 hills above the gorge of the Orontes River, where Saladin had positioned his veterans and waited for the combined armies of Aleppo and Mosul to come to him. They came. Saif ad-Din of Mosul commanded forces that outnumbered Saladin's by a substantial margin and included the best Turkish cavalry the Zengid system had produced. Saladin had spent years building an army that fought together. The difference was decisive. The Zengid coalition broke, and Saladin chased its fragments back toward Aleppo. The political consequence of Hama was immediate. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, who had been watching the Syrian contest with the careful attention of a man whose nominal authority rested entirely on which strongman chose to acknowledge it, sent a diploma confirming Saladin as Sultan of Egypt and Syria. It was the formal sanctification of a fait accompli, and both men knew it. Saladin had fought the Zengids, defeated them, and been rewarded with the legal title that reframed the victory as legitimate succession rather than conquest. He had understood from the beginning that title mattered as much as territory. The diploma from Baghdad did something that no military victory could fully accomplish. It placed the ideological weight of Sunni legitimacy behind an outcome that his enemies still characterized as aggression against the House of Zengi. Saladin circulated the diploma widely. He had it read from pulpits, he had it inscribed on coinage. Every surface that could carry his new title carried it, because every surface was a message to the emirs of Aleppo and Mosul about what the structure of authority now looked like. Aleppo held out. The city would not fall to Saladin for another 8 years, and its resistance would force him into the compromise of a formal truce in which As-Salih remained nominally in place, and Gumushtigin retained a subordinate governorship. This was the Ayyubid pattern in Syria: pressure, negotiation, a settlement that preserved local dignity while surrendering local autonomy. Saladin rarely destroyed what he could absorb. The Zengid infrastructure, the administrative apparatus, the military culture, the madrasa networks Nur ad-Din had built, was too valuable to demolish. He wanted its loyalty, not its ruins. The language he used to justify everything he did in Syria rested on a single claim: that the Zengid princes had abandoned the project Nur ad-Din had devoted his life to, and that someone had to carry it forward. He was not taking Syria from the Zengids, he was saving it from the Zengids' failure to defend it against the Crusaders and against each other. The argument was self-serving, and everyone who heard it knew that. It was also compelling, and most people who heard it acted as if it were true. That gap between what everyone knew and what everyone acted upon was the space in which the Ayyubid state was built. By the end of 1175, Saladin held Damascus and its hinterland, had defeated the most powerful Zengid coalition that could be assembled against him, and had received formal recognition from the Abbasid Caliph. He had done it in less than 18 months after leaving Egypt, without ever dropping the language of service to as-Salih, and without ever committing himself to a single act of open aggression that his enemies could hold up as evidence of bad faith. The seizure of Syria had been conducted entirely in the vocabulary of protection. That was the point. The decade between 1174 and 1186 was not a preparation for the war against the Crusaders. It was the war, a different war, fought with different weapons against a different enemy. Saladin spent those years defeating, absorbing, bribing, marrying into, and diplomatically outmaneuvering the princes of the Islamic world, one by one, until the coalition he needed existed. The Franks were the declared enemy. The Zengid princes of Aleppo and Mosul, the independent emirs of the Jazira, the lords of Sinjar and Mardin. These were the actual obstacles. They stood between Saladin and the unified command, without which no campaign against Jerusalem was possible. The logic of the jihad framework was ruthless in its application. Saladin had inherited from Nur ad-Din a language of Islamic unity that carried within it an implicit accusation against anyone who refused to participate. Every prince who resisted Saladin was, in this framing, choosing local interest over the liberation of the faith. Every emir who withheld his troops was, by the same logic, complicit in the continued Frankish occupation of Jerusalem. Saladin used this language with precision, not as rhetoric alone, but as a genuine political weapon that placed his opponents in an impossible position. To fight him was to fight the holy war. That was not a charge most Muslim rulers could sustain indefinitely without cost to their own legitimacy. He also used marriage. In 1176, he married Ismat ad-Din Khatun, the widow of Nur ad-Din himself. The symbolism was deliberate and exact. Saladin was not displacing the Zengid legacy, he was inheriting it. He was the continuation of Nur ad-Din's project, not its supplanter. The marriage gave him a dynastic connection to the man whose memory the Zengid princes invoked against him. It cost him nothing militarily and was worth more than most of the battles he fought that year. Aleppo was the long problem. The city had resisted him since 1174, sheltered behind its walls and its custody of the young as-Salih. And its resistance had survived the Battle of Hama, survived 2 assassination attempts on Saladin's life, survived the death of as-Salih himself in 1181. By 1182, Aleppo was governed by Imad ad-Din Zangi, not the founder of the dynasty, but a grandson of that name. A man who held the city without the resources or the political will to defend it indefinitely against an enemy that controlled Egypt, Damascus, Homs, Hama, and the surrounding countryside. Saladin besieged Aleppo on the 21st of May, 1183. The siege lasted weeks rather than months. Imad ad-Din's treasury had been stripped by his predecessor. His garrison was underpaid and demoralized. When Saladin offered him Sinjar, Nisibin, Saruj, and Raqqa, good territories, enough to sustain a comfortable lordship, Imad ad-Din accepted. On the 11th of June, 1183, Saladin rode into the citadel of Aleppo. He was generous with the garrison and the population who had feared the worst. The city he had been trying to take for 9 years opened to him in the end, not through assault, but through an offer too reasonable to refuse. Mosul was harder, in a different way. The city sat at the eastern anchor of the Zengid world, commanded by Izz ad-Din of the Mosul branch of the family, and it had behind it the prestige of being the seat from which Zengi himself had launched the dynasty's greatness. Saladin besieged it in the autumn of 1185, but Mosul's walls were formidable, its garrison determined, and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, whose support Saladin required, was reluctant to give his blessing to the reduction of a city that had long been loyal to his house. The siege stalled. The diplomatic campaign around Mosul was as important as the military one. Saladin sent letters to Baghdad arguing that the Zengids of Mosul had spent their history supporting the Seljuks, rivals of the Abbasid Caliphate, and only sought the caliph's protection when it suited them. He argued that Mosul's emirs were obstructing the holy war by refusing to contribute their forces, and that a unified command under Saladin was the only mechanism by which Jerusalem could realistically be retaken. The argument was designed to put the caliph in an uncomfortable position. Refusing to support Saladin meant choosing the Zengids over the liberation of the city that every Muslim ruler was supposed to want. The treaty that resolved the Mosul question was signed in March 1186. Izz ad-Din retained his city. He kept his title. He acknowledged Saladin's suzerainty and committed to supplying troops when called upon. He was not destroyed. He was incorporated. The pattern repeated exactly what Saladin had done everywhere else. Maximum pressure applied until the moment the opponent chose survival over resistance, then generous terms that preserved local dignity while securing military and political subordination. By the time the treaty was signed, Mosul's army was functionally part of the Ayyubid coalition, even though Mosul remained formally under Zengid rule. The Jazira, the fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates in northern Mesopotamia, was secured through a combination of invitation and campaign. The emir of Harran, Muzaffar ad-Din Gokbori, invited Saladin to take the region in 1182, and Saladin moved through it methodically, absorbing city after city. Edessa, Saruj, Raqqa, Kirkisiya, Nusaybin, each fell in sequence. Sinjar fell after a 15-day siege. When Izz ad-Din assembled a coalition from Aleppo, Mosul, Mardin, and Armenia to stop the advance, they marched toward Saladin at Harran, and then, on hearing he was ready for them, sent envoys asking for peace instead. Saladin's secretary wrote afterward that they advanced like men and vanished like women. The coalition dissolved without a battle. The assassins occupied a particular position in this landscape. The Nizari Ismaili order, based in the mountain fortresses of the Syrian coastal range, had already tried to kill Saladin twice on behalf of Aleppo. In August 1176, Saladin marched into their territory, burned the surrounding countryside, and found he could not take the fortresses. He withdrew. The terms that followed, arranged through the mediation of his uncle, the governor of Hama, left the assassins in place, but neutralized as a hostile force. Saladin could not destroy them and chose not to spend more lives trying. He settled for their non-interference, which was worth nearly as much. Across all of these campaigns, the instruments Saladin reached for most often were not the sword, but the offer and the letter. He wrote to princes explaining why resistance was futile and why submission was honorable. He wrote to the Abbasid Caliph, framing each campaign as a service to Islamic unity. He wrote to the emirs whose loyalty he had secured, asking them to relay his arguments to their neighbors. His court maintained a permanent apparatus of correspondence. The scholars Al-Qadi al-Fadil and Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani crafted his public communications with the precision of men who understood that a well-composed letter could accomplish what a siege could not. The pen was not mightier than the sword in Saladin's world. It was an equally essential part of the same system. By the spring of 1186, the coalition existed. Egypt supplied the money. Syria supplied the cavalry. The Jazeera supplied additional forces under treaty obligation. Aleppo, which had defied him for 9 years, was now his base of northern operations. Mosul, which had never submitted to any power since Zengi built it into the dynasty's cornerstone, was technically subordinate to Saladin's command. The assassins were neutralized. The independent emirs of the Jazeera were absorbed. The enterprise had taken 12 years of sustained, methodical effort across the full range of medieval political instruments: war, marriage, bribery, ideology, and diplomacy. And it was now, at last, complete. Saladin turned to face the Franks. He had spent the previous decade raiding the Kingdom of Jerusalem periodically, probing its defenses, testing its responses, learning where it was strong and where it was fragile. He had lost a battle at Montgisar in 1177, a defeat he absorbed and learned from with the specific discipline of a man who understood that the object was not any individual engagement, but the final outcome. He had destroyed a Crusader fortress under construction at Jacob's Ford in 1179. He had watched the kingdom tear itself apart over who should rule it. He knew the enemy was ready to be broken. He was, at last, ready to break it. Beneath the campaigns, the sieges, and the ideological arguments ran the machinery that made all of it possible. Saladin was not only a general and a diplomat, he was the architect of a state, and the state he built was the instrument without which 1187 could not have happened. It had a fiscal structure, a military organization, a legal and religious apparatus, and an administrative core that held it together across 3 distinct territories with different histories, different populations, and different relationships to the man at the top. Understanding what Saladin actually built requires looking at each of these mechanisms in turn. The financial foundation was Egypt. The Nile Valley, managed by the most sophisticated fiscal bureaucracy in the medieval Islamic world, generated revenues that no rival in the region could match. Saladin inherited this system from the Fatimids and kept most of it intact, including its personnel. The man who became the administrative brain of his entire operation, Qadi al-Fadil, a brilliant jurist from Ascalon, had served the Fatimid government before Saladin arrived. His talent was too valuable to discard on doctrinal grounds. He became Saladin's head of chancery, managing the correspondence, the legal instruments, and the tax administration that the Sultan's campaigns depended on. The new dynasty ran, in part, on the human capital it had inherited from the one it displaced. The Iqta system, the assignment of land grant revenues to military officers in exchange for the obligation to provide equipped cavalry when called, was the mechanism by which Saladin converted territorial control into military force. He had seen the system operate under the Zengids and understood its logic precisely. When he arrived in Egypt as vizier in 1169, he began immediately confiscating the Iqta grants held by Fatimid soldiers and reassigning them to his own officers. The land did not change. The obligation attached to it changed entirely, from a Fatimid loyalty structure to an Ayyubid one. By the time Saladin moved into Syria, the same rewiring was applied to every territory he absorbed. The army that resulted from this system was not ethnically homogeneous, and Saladin never tried to make it so. His forces combined Kurdish tribal cavalry, the military culture his own family had come from, with Turkish professional soldiers whose skills had been the backbone of every major Islamic army since the Seljuks, with Arab auxiliary forces, and with a residual contingent of soldiers whose ultimate loyalty was to the Abbasid ideological framework, rather than any dynastic patron. Managing this mixture required constant attention. Kurdish officers distrusted Turkish ones. Turkish commanders had their own patronage networks and their own ideas about precedence. Saladin held it together through personal relationship, through the careful distribution of Iqta revenues, and through the shared framework of the jihad enterprise, which gave every faction a reason to subordinate its internal competition to the external objective. The army he commanded at the raid on Palestine in 1177 numbered, by the account of the Crusader chronicler William of Tyre, around 26,000 soldiers. This was not the maximum Saladin could field. It was a raiding force, not the full coalition. The combined army he would eventually assemble for the Hattin campaign drew on Egypt, Syria, the Jazeera, and the treaty obligations of Mosul simultaneously. The scale of that mobilization was only possible because the Iqta administration functioned reliably enough to pay and equip forces from geographically dispersed territories under a single campaign command. The citadel of Cairo, whose construction Saladin began in 1176, was the physical expression of the new order's permanence. It sat on a promontory of the Muqaddam Hills overlooking the city, commanding the approaches from every direction, and it was designed to function as both a military fortress and the administrative center of government. The Fatimid palaces had been the seat of a ceremonial state. The citadel was the headquarters of a war machine. The difference in architecture reflected a difference in what the state was for. The madrasa program was the ideological infrastructure of the same project. Within 11 years of taking Egypt, Saladin had built 5 new madrasas in Cairo and the surrounding area, each endowed as a waqf, a charitable trust whose revenues were permanently dedicated to its operation. The first stood near the tomb of the Imam al-Shafi'i, the founder of the legal school to which Saladin himself adhered, and it drew Sunni scholars from across the Eastern Islamic world to staff it. These institutions trained judges, legal scholars, and administrators who would operate the new Sunni order. They also trained preachers who delivered the Friday sermon, the khutbah, in every mosque across Egypt and Syria, week after week, in the form that named the Abbasid Caliph and implicitly endorsed the Sultan who governed in his shadow. The same pattern was replicated in Syria. Madrasas went up in Damascus, in Aleppo after its capture, in the provincial cities of the Jazeera. Each one was endowed with waqf revenues, which made it financially independent of the political changes that might follow Saladin's death, a durable investment in Sunni orthodoxy that outlasted the man who built it. The Ayyubid institutional program was not designed purely for Saladin's reign. It was designed to produce a religious and administrative culture that would persist regardless of who sat on the throne. The chancery, the bureaucratic engine of Saladin's correspondence, was itself an instrument of power. Qadi al-Fadil and the scholar Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani managed a permanent flow of letters, decrees, and diplomatic communications that projected Saladin's authority across his territories and beyond them. These documents were not merely administrative. They were political performances, carefully crafted texts that framed every military action in the language of Sunni revival, every territorial acquisition in the language of service to the Caliph, every refusal to submit by a rival prince in the language of obstruction to the holy war. The chancery was where the jihad narrative was manufactured and distributed. The intelligence apparatus that ran beneath all of this is less visible in the sources, but unmistakably present in the outcomes. Saladin consistently knew when his enemies were vulnerable before they knew it themselves. He learned of the conspiracy against him in Cairo in 1169 before it could act. He tracked the political deterioration inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem across the 1180s with a precision that suggests sustained intelligence collection. He knew when the Crusader factions were paralyzed by their internal disputes and when they were capable of mounting a coherent defense. Military planning of the quality he demonstrated at Hattin does not emerge from instinct alone. It requires a continuous stream of information about the enemy's internal condition. The relationship between Egypt and Syria within the Ayyubid structure was not a merger, but an integration. Each territory retained its own administrative personnel, its own local fiscal arrangements, its own garrison structure. What Saladin imposed on top of this was a unified command layer, his own appointments at the senior level, his own family members governing the most critical provinces, the Iqta system ensuring that military obligation flowed upward to him regardless of local administrative variations. The state was a confederation held together at its peak by personal authority and at its base by fiscal arrangements that made defection economically irrational for the men who depended on them. The family dimension of this structure was essential and, in retrospect, its most dangerous feature. Saladin placed brothers, nephews, and cousins in the governorships of Egypt's key provinces and Syria's major cities. His brother Al-Adil governed Egypt during the Syrian campaigns. His nephew Taqi ad-Din governed Hama. Another brother governed Damascus while Saladin was in the field. This gave him trusted representatives in critical positions who shared a direct interest in the dynasty's survival. It also created a network of powerful relatives with territorial bases, military forces, and personal ambitions. Men whose loyalty to the Ayyubid project was genuine, but whose loyalty to Saladin personally was conditional in ways that would only become apparent after he was gone. By the spring of 1186, the machine was complete. Egypt supplied the money. The Iqta system converted money into cavalry. The madrasa network supplied the ideological framework and the administrative personnel. The chancery produced the narrative. The family held the key positions. The Mosul Treaty supplied additional forces. The Jazeera was absorbed. Aleppo had been taken. The entire apparatus, fiscal, military, religious, diplomatic, was oriented toward a single objective that Saladin had carried since his first years in Cairo. What stood between him and that objective was a kingdom in the process of destroying itself. While Saladin spent the 1170s and 1180s assembling his coalition, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was engaged in a project of its own, the systematic exhaustion of its own political capacity. The kingdom that faced Saladin in 1187 was not the kingdom that had defeated him at Montchisar in 1177. It had the same walls, the same ports, the same military orders. What it had lost in the intervening decade was the institutional coherence to make decisions and enforce them. The story of how that happened is inseparable from the story of how Hattin became possible. Baldwin IV had been 13 years old when he took the throne in 1174, and already afflicted with leprosy, a disease that attacked his extremities first, then his face, then his ability to govern. He was crowned 4 days after his father died. For the first years of his reign, Raymond III of Tripoli served as regent, a man of genuine political intelligence whose consistent counsel was that the kingdom could survive only by avoiding pitched battles it could not afford to lose. Baldwin, as he grew into his role, demonstrated a military aptitude that surprised everyone. He defeated Saladin personally at Montchisar, riding into battle with his arm already destroyed by the disease. He fought, as his contemporary biographer noted, with a patience beyond his years. But Baldwin could not marry, could not produce an heir, and could not hold his body together long enough to outlast the succession crisis that surrounded him. The kingdom's political life became consumed by the question of who would follow him. His sister Sibylla was the heir, and who she married would determine who wielded real power. The factions that assembled around this question were not divided by policy alone. They were divided by personal ambition, family rivalry, and the accumulated resentments of a small colonial society in which every great lord knew every other, and none of them trusted each other very much. Raymond of Tripoli represented the older baronial class, men who had spent their lives in the Levant, understood the realities of coexistence, and believed the kingdom's survival depended on periodic accommodation with its neighbors. Raynald of Chatillon represented something else entirely. He had been in the Levant since the Second Crusade, had spent 15 years in a Muslim prison after overreaching his authority, and had emerged from captivity with his aggression undiminished and his judgment no more reliable than when he went in. He regarded every truce as a temporary obstacle and every caravan route passing near his lands as a legitimate target. The two men's approaches to the same geopolitical reality were irreconcilable, and both of them ended up in the same war council. Guy of Lusignan entered this system in 1180 through his marriage to Sibylla, and immediately demonstrated the specific quality that would cost the kingdom everything. He was a man who could not command the respect of the barons around him and did not know it. Baldwin IV recognized this. He stripped Guy of the regency in 1183 after Guy failed to engage Saladin's army during a raid on the kingdom, an act of military timidity that the king regarded as unforgivable. Baldwin then had his 5-year-old nephew, Sibylla's son, Baldwin V, crowned co-king, with Raymond of Tripoli named as regent for the child. The intention was to keep Guy away from real power. It did not survive Baldwin IV's death. Baldwin IV died in May of 1185, 24 years old. Baldwin V died in 1186, 8 years old. At that point, the machinery of the succession, stripped of the one man capable of holding it together, operated exactly as the factions had designed it to. Sibylla was crowned queen. She then crowned her own husband king, placing the diadem on Guy's head herself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Raymond of Tripoli, who had every legitimate claim to protest, found himself outmaneuvered. The kingdom had a king that the most experienced members of its ruling class did not trust and could not remove. Raymond retreated to his own lands and briefly made a private truce with Saladin, an act that his enemies used to characterize him as a traitor, and which Saladin used as intelligence about the fractures running through the kingdom's command structure. Raynald of Chatillon then removed the last obstacle between Saladin and the decision he had been building toward for a decade. In late 1186 or early 1187, Raynald seized a large commercial caravan traveling through his territory from Egypt to Syria, imprisoned the merchants and their families, and refused to pay the compensation Saladin demanded through King Guy. His stated position was that he was lord of his own lands and had made no peace with Saladin personally. This was technically incoherent. The truce between the kingdom and Saladin legally covered Raynald's territory, but Raynald had spent his career treating inconvenient legal arrangements as optional. The caravan had been an opportunity, and he had taken it. Saladin's response was calibrated. He sent his son Al-Afdal and the Emir Gokburi to raid the lands around Acre, a demonstration of intent rather than a full campaign. In May of 1187, at a place called the Springs of Cresson, Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, encountered a Muslim raiding force and charged it with around 130 knights against a force many times that size. He was advised by his own officers not to engage. He charged anyway. The Templars were destroyed, 150 knights killed, 300-foot soldiers cut down. The most elite heavy cavalry the kingdom possessed had just been bled to a fraction of its strength by one man's decision to treat an overwhelming numerical disadvantage as irrelevant. Saladin assembled his full coalition army in the summer of 1187, forces from Egypt, Syria, the Jazira, and Mosul under a single command, the largest force he had ever put in the field. He crossed the Jordan River on the 26th of June with more than 30,000 troops and laid siege to Tiberias on the 2nd of July. trapping Raymond of Tripoli's wife Esheva inside its citadel. The choice of Tiberias was precise. It was Raymond's own city, which placed Raymond in an impossible position and forced the War Council to argue about a situation that Raymond himself was emotionally entangled in. That War Council, held on the night of the 2nd of July at the Crusader base of Sepphoris, was the moment the kingdom destroyed itself. Raymond argued, coolly, correctly, and with the authority of a man who had studied Saladin for a decade, that the march from Sepphoris to Tiberias was exactly what Saladin wanted. The route ran through the waterless hills of Galilee in midsummer heat. A moving army in full armor, without secure water, against an opponent who controlled every spring along the route, was an army being invited to die of thirst before it reached the battlefield. Raymond said he was willing to lose Tiberias. It was a castle. Losing the army was losing the kingdom. Gérard de Riedfort and Reynald of Châtillon overrode him. Gérard accused Raymond of cowardice. Reynald accused him of treasonous sympathy with the enemy, a charge that cut deeper given the private truce Raymond had made months earlier. Guy, who had spent his entire reign failing to command the room, found himself unable to ignore the louder voices. In the early hours of the 3rd of July, he reversed the decision he had reached hours before, ordering the army to march. Raymond, watching this, said nothing more than the source's record. The army moved out of Sepphoris at dawn. What followed across the 3rd and 4th of July, 1187, was not a battle that Saladin won. It was a battle that the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost before it began. Saladin's mounted archers harassed the column throughout the march, bleeding the rearguard of Templars continuously and preventing the army from moving at any useful speed. That evening, the army camped on a waterless hillside, unable to reach Tiberias and unable to turn back. Saladin's forces set fire to the dry grass around the camp during the night and brought camel loads of water up from the Sea of Galilee for their own troops. The Crusader army woke on the 4th of July, dehydrated, smoke-blinded, and surrounded. Raymond of Tripoli led a charge that broke through Saladin's lines. Saladin's commanders deliberately opened a gap to let it through, and Raymond escaped. Everything he had left behind was destroyed. Guy of Lusignan was captured with the majority of the kingdom's great lords. Reynald of Châtillon was brought to Saladin's tent, where Saladin offered Guy water and, when Guy passed the cup to Reynald, struck it from his hands. Reynald was the man he had sworn to kill. He executed him personally. The true cross, the most sacred relic in the Crusader world, carried into every battle as a symbol of divine protection, was captured. In the weeks that followed, Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Toron, Sidon, Beirut, and Ascalon fell in sequence. The kingdom had reduced itself through a decade of factional self-destruction to a condition in which one bad decision at a war council could collapse it entirely. Saladin had not manufactured that condition. He had simply been patient enough to wait for it. After Hattin, the kingdom came apart in weeks. Acre fell, Nablus fell. Jaffa, Toron, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, city after city opened its gates or fell to assault between July and September of 1187. The garrisons that had stripped men from every fortress to fill the army at Hattin now had nothing to defend with. Saladin moved through the coastal plain and the hinterland with a systematic thoroughness that left almost no defensible position intact. By mid-September, only Tyre still held, saved by the chance arrival of Conrad of Montferrat, who had sailed in from Constantinople without knowing what he was arriving into and immediately organized the city's defense. Everything else was gone. Jerusalem itself held fewer than 14 nights when Saladin's forces arrived in late September. Balian of Ibalin, who had escaped Hattin by luck and had ridden to Jerusalem to retrieve his family, found the city begging him to command its defense instead. He had given Saladin an oath not to take up arms in exchange for safe passage. He sent word to Saladin explaining what the city's inhabitants had demanded of him. Saladin released him from the oath, arranged an escort for Balian's wife and children out of the city, and prepared to besiege the place. The exchange was entirely characteristic of both men, Balian fulfilling an obligation that had become impossible to maintain, Saladin releasing him from it without drama because a negotiated surrender of Jerusalem was worth more to him than a chivalric technicality. Balian knighted 60 young men, sons of knights and burgesses who had reached the age of 16, because he needed something that looked like a garrison. The city was packed with refugees from every part of the kingdom that had fallen over the summer. They were civilians mostly, farmers, merchants, women, children, people who had fled the only direction left to flee and now found themselves inside a city that had no army and no realistic hope of relief. Balian stored food, rationed water, and prepared for the inevitable. The siege began on the 20th of September. Saladin's engineers and sappers went to work on the northern walls near the Damascus Gate, undermining the foundations while his siege engines battered the defenses. The defenders held longer than any rational assessment of their strength suggested they should. By the end of September, the walls were breached. Balian's knighted teenagers fought back through a breach that would have been indefensible against a professional force of any real size. For a few days they held it. They could not hold it indefinitely. Balian rode out to Saladin's camp as the walls were failing and made the argument that changed the terms of the surrender. He could not, he told the Sultan, prevent what would happen if Saladin's troops fought their way in through the breach. The garrison would kill every Muslim prisoner held in the city. The holy sites of Islam would be destroyed. Jerusalem would be taken stone by stone. It was a threat born of desperation, and Saladin knew it as well as Balian did. It was also a threat that a sufficiently desperate garrison could probably have carried out. Saladin had not spent 20 years building a coalition and a state and a reputation in order to take Jerusalem in a manner that would horrify the Islamic world whose unity he had constructed it all upon. He agreed to terms. The terms were ransom rather than massacre. 10 dinars for every man who could pay, 5 for every woman, 1 for every child. Those who could not pay would be enslaved. There were, Balian told him, around 20,000 people in the city who had no means of paying any of it. After considerable negotiation, specific, practical, conducted across a table rather than through intermediaries, they settled on 30,000 dinars from the city's treasury to free 7,000 of the destitute. That money came from a fund King Henry II of England had deposited in Jerusalem years before as penance for the murder of Thomas Becket, held by the Hospitallers, and now spent for a purpose Henry II had never envisioned. Balian surrendered the Tower of David on the 2nd of October 1187. The departure was orderly, and by the standards of medieval warfare, extraordinarily restrained. 3 columns of refugees left the city under escort. Templars and Hospitallers leading the first 2, Balian leading the third with his newly knighted young men. Saladin's brother Al-Adil asked for 1,000 Christian slaves as a gift for his services and immediately released them all. The Latin patriarch, Heraclius, was given 700 slaves to free. Balian received 500. Saladin released the elderly unconditionally. He released another 1,000 who claimed to come from the city of Edessa because one of his commanders said they were his countrymen. Despite all of this, approximately 15,000 people who could not pay their ransom were led away into slavery. The mercy was real. It was also incomplete. The Dome of the Rock, which the Crusaders had converted into a church and used as a headquarters for the Knights Templar for nearly 90 years, was washed with rosewater from its foundations to its dome, inside and out. The Christian cross that had been placed atop it was pulled down. For 2 days it was carried through the streets of Jerusalem and beaten, a public act whose deliberate visibility was not accident, but message. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was restored to its function. Saladin ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre sealed for 3 days while he decided its fate. His advisors divided on whether to destroy it or protect it. He chose protection, citing the precedent of the Caliph Umar, who had taken the church under his personal guardianship when the Arabs first captured Jerusalem in the 7th century. The church stood. Christian pilgrims would be permitted to visit. The contrast with 1199, the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem, was immediate, specific, and entirely deliberate. That conquest had ended in a massacre so thorough that the chroniclers writing about it, some of them participants, described the blood running through the streets to the depth of a man's knees. Saladin's conquest ended with refugees being escorted out of the city by armed guards. He had not ordered mercy out of weakness or sentiment. He had ordered it because the specific political value of this particular act of mercy was calculable, and he had calculated it. The news reached Europe with the speed of the fastest available ships and the shock of something that had been quietly expected for years and still landed as a catastrophe when it finally came. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi on the 29th of October, before he had even received confirmation of Jerusalem's fall. The news of Hattin had been enough. The bull called for a new crusade, attributed the loss of the Holy City to the sins of Christendom, and set in motion the fundraising, recruitment, and diplomatic negotiation that would take 2 years to produce an army. In France and England, a special tax was levied, the Saladin tithe, naming him explicitly as the enemy against whom Christian Europe was now obligated to spend its treasure. Inside the Islamic world, the reaction was of an entirely different character. The khutbah in Jerusalem was delivered in the Sunni form for the first time in nearly a century. The city that had occupied the ideological center of Nur ad-Din's project. The city that Saladin had promised to the Abbasid Caliph years before as the prize of a unified Islamic effort, was now, in fact, restored. Scholars, poets, and officials at courts from Baghdad to Cairo composed panegyrics. Saladin received delegations bearing congratulations from princes who had resisted him for years. The achievement provided for a moment the unifying confirmation that the entire Ayyubid project had been built to produce. But Saladin understood something about the moment that the congratulations obscured. The Third Crusade was coming. He had not taken Tyre, the one coastal city that had held through the summer, because Conrad of Montferrat had arrived at exactly the right moment, and Tyre was the port through which any crusading reinforcement would land. The same day Jerusalem was secured. The strategic problem that would define the next 5 years was already visible. He had won the war's central prize. He had not ended the war. The siege of Acre began in August 1189, 2 years before the kings of Europe arrived. Guy of Lusignan, released from captivity by Saladin, whose release of him Saladin almost certainly came to regret, led the remnant of the Crusader kingdom's forces to the walls of the city Saladin had captured after Hattin and began a counter-siege. The strategic logic was sound. Acre was the most important port in the Levant, and whoever held it controlled the sea lanes through which any future crusading force would have to arrive. If Guy could retake it, he gave the Third Crusade a base. If Saladin could relieve it, he broke the Crusader recovery before it began. Neither side achieved its objective quickly. For 2 years the armies faced each other across the lines. Besiegers besieged in turn, both bleeding from disease, starvation, and repeated assault, in a stalemate whose resolution waited on the arrival of the kings. Philip II of France arrived in April of 1191. Richard I of England arrived on the 8th of June. Both brought fresh troops, siege equipment, and, in Richard's case, an immediate, systematic competence in the mechanics of siege warfare that transformed the effort. The Ayyubid garrison inside Acre surrendered on the 12th of July, in violation of Saladin's explicit orders not to. Saladin had been unable to break through to them. He stood outside the walls and watched the flags of France and England go up over a city he had spent 2 years trying to hold. His inability to relieve Acre was the first demonstration that the machine he had built, formidable as it was, had structural limits. Those limits became visible more clearly in August. Richard had negotiated a surrender agreement with Acre's garrison. The Muslim soldiers would be freed in exchange for the return of the True Cross, a payment of 200,000 dinars, and the release of Christian prisoners. Saladin delayed, arguing about the terms and the timeline. On the 20th of August, Richard had 2,700 Muslim prisoners decapitated in full view of Saladin's army. The act was calculated as much as it was brutal. Richard needed to move his army south and could not march encumbered by prisoners. But the signal it sent to Saladin was unambiguous. This was not the kind of enemy whose mercy could be relied upon to constrain his military decisions. Saladin executed his own Christian prisoners in response, and both sides understood that the war had acquired a different quality. Richard marched his army south from Acre on the 25th of August, heading for Jaffa along the coast. He had studied Hattin. Every lesson the disaster had taught about what not to do, Richard had absorbed and reversed. The sea protected his right flank. Supply ships sailed alongside the column and resupplied it by smaller boat. He positioned his cavalry between 2 columns of infantry to shield the horses from arrows. He forbade any soldier to break ranks to engage the harassing Muslim mounted archers, no matter how severe the provocation, on pain of the most severe punishment he could impose. Saladin's horse archers swarmed the column for days, targeting the rear, filling the air with arrows, testing the formation's cohesion. It held. Saladin committed his full army to a pitched confrontation on the 7th of September at Arsuf, 30 miles north of Jaffa. His forces outnumbered the Crusaders substantially. His mounted archers concentrated their fire on the Hospitallers at the rear of the column, killing horses by the dozen, pressing so hard that the knights' discipline broke before Richard's order came. 2 Hospitaller knights charged. The formation unraveled into a general charge that Richard had not yet authorized, but which he immediately supported with the full weight of his cavalry. The Ayyubid army was thrown back with heavy casualties, over 7,000 dead against perhaps 700 on the Crusader side. Saladin had discovered what Hattin had confirmed from the other direction. Matched against a disciplined professional force fighting on ground and terms of its own choosing, the Ayyubid coalition was not unbeatable. He chose never to risk another open battle against Richard. After Arsuf, Saladin's strategy shifted to attrition and evasion, hold the key positions, deny the Crusaders the hinterland they needed to support a siege of Jerusalem, exhaust the coalition by keeping it on campaign without delivering the decisive engagement Richard was trying to force. It was tactically reasonable. It was also a strategy that put the burden of holding the coalition together onto Saladin personally, month after month in the field, against a man who did not tire and did not make the kind of errors that allowed the Ayyubid approach to work. By November of 1191, the Crusader army was advancing inland toward Jerusalem. Saladin found himself, for the first time since the Syrian campaigns of the 1170s, facing exactly the institutional pressure his system had always been designed to suppress. His emirs were exhausted, their Iqta revenues disrupted by the prolonged campaign, their men wanting to go home. On the 12th of December, he was forced by their pressure to disband the greater part of his army. The machine that had been built on personal authority rather than durable obligation was showing, under sustained pressure, what personal authority without institutional backup actually meant. When the emirs decided their obligation had been met, they went home and left their sultan in the field. Richard reached Beit Nuba, 12 miles from Jerusalem, and stopped. He stopped twice, in December of 1191, and again in the following summer after a second advance. Both times he turned back without attempting the assault. His stated reason was strategic and correct. He lacked control of the hinterland, could not supply a siege, and could not hold Jerusalem even if he took it. His actual position was harder than the strategy admitted. The army he commanded was a coalition of French, English, German, Italian, and Crusader lords who agreed on almost nothing except the symbolic objective before them. The prospect of turning back from 12 miles short of Jerusalem was, for the rank and file, incomprehensible. Richard made the decision anyway. It was probably the right military choice. It cost him whatever remained of the political support his expedition had left. The fighting continued through the summer of 1192 with a quality of exhausted attrition on both sides. Saladin retook Jaffa in late July with a sudden assault while Richard was preparing to sail for home. The city fell in days, its small garrison overwhelmed before help could arrive. Richard turned his fleet around and personally led a counter-assault. He waded ashore with a handful of knights and drove Saladin's forces out of the lower city in a single morning. A few days later, Saladin attacked again with his full cavalry force. Richard met them on the beach at the head of perhaps 2,000 infantry and a dozen mounted knights. His crossbowmen held every charge. Saladin's cavalry withdrew. The Muslim chronicler Baha ad-Din, who was present, wrote that Richard had ridden along the full length of the Ayyubid army from right to left with his lance, and not one of Saladin's soldiers left the ranks to attack him. The Sultan, according to the same source, left the field in anger. The Treaty of Jaffa was signed on the 2nd of September 1192. Its terms were a careful mutual acknowledgement of what each side had actually achieved. Saladin retained Jerusalem, the interior of Palestine, and the religious structures he had restored. Richard retained the coastline from Tyre to Jaffa, a strip sufficient to sustain a viable Crusader state. Christian pilgrims and merchants would be permitted free access to Jerusalem. It was a 3-year truce rather than a permanent settlement. Neither side had any intention of allowing the current situation to become the final one. But the treaty created a framework within which both armies could stop fighting because both had become incapable of winning. The structural revelation of the Third Crusade was not Saladin's failure to hold everything he had taken after Hattin. Losing territory to a well-organized crusading force supplied by the best navy in the Mediterranean was not a military disgrace. The revelation was the condition of the army that fought it. The coalition that had assembled behind the banner of jihad in 1186, with all its Iqta obligations, its treaty-bound Mosul contingent, its absorbed Zengid forces, had not dissolved as a unit. But it had operated under sustained pressure, according to its actual nature, a collection of men serving personal and local interests who stayed in the field as long as the political and economic logic held, and left when it did not. The emirs who forced Saladin to disband his army in December 1191 were not betraying him. They were behaving exactly as men in their position had always behaved. The system had been built to direct that behavior toward a collective objective. Under the pressure of a year-long campaign against Richard, it ran out of the capacity to do so. What Saladin accomplished against the Third Crusade was, by any reasonable assessment, remarkable. He held Jerusalem. He held the interior. He fought the finest military commander of his generation to a standstill. He did it with an army that was dissolving beneath him through most of the campaign's final months. But the question that the Third Crusade posed was not whether Saladin was a brilliant enough commander to survive it. The question was whether the structure he had built could survive without him. And the answer that 1192 had quietly produced was already legible, for anyone willing to read it in the emirs' faces as they rode home before the battle was over. Richard sailed for England on the 9th of October, 1192. Saladin rode to Damascus. The two men who had spent 3 years trying to destroy each other had, between them, produced an outcome in which neither had won and neither had lost decisively, and in which the fundamental strategic situation, a Muslim-held Jerusalem with a Crusader coastal strip to its west, was roughly what each side needed to survive. Saladin returned to the city he had spent 20 years building his state to reclaim. He was 54 years old, physically worn to the edge of what his body could carry, and the most consequential question about his empire was no longer whether it could beat Richard. It was whether it could outlast him. The Treaty of Jaffa was signed on the 2nd of September 1192, and neither man who signed it was satisfied with what it said. That mutual dissatisfaction was not a failure of diplomacy. It was an accurate description of the military reality both sides had arrived at after 3 years of fighting. Each side had achieved what it could achieve. Neither had achieved what it had come for. The treaty said as much in its terms, and everyone who read it understood what those terms admitted about the limits of the systems that had produced them. The Crusaders would hold the coast from Tyre south to Jaffa. The strip was narrow, dependent on sea resupply, and militarily viable only so long as Western Europe continued to send ships and men. It was not the kingdom of Jerusalem that had existed before Hattin. It was what a kingdom looks like when a kingdom has been reduced to the minimum required to survive. But it was enough to anchor a Crusader presence in the Levant, which was what a century of settlement and investment had been trying to preserve, and which Saladin's post-Hattin campaign had come so close to eliminating entirely. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Saladin had held this position through every negotiation and never moved from it. Richard had proposed, through the mediation of Al-Adil, a marriage alliance that would give his sister Joan to Saladin's brother, along with Jerusalem as a kind of joint sovereignty arrangement. Joan had refused. Saladin had found the proposal incompatible with the position he had spent 20 years building toward. The city that was the entire ideological justification for the Ayyubid project was not negotiable, and Saladin's refusal to trade it away under military pressure was the one thing in the treaty that was not a compromise. Christian pilgrims, unarmed, traveling on the roads of a Muslim-governed territory, would be permitted free passage to Jerusalem and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a provision that satisfied nobody completely, and that both sides could read as a partial victory. Richard had not taken Jerusalem. The crusading enterprise had been premised on the military seizure of a holy city, and returning home with a pilgrimage access agreement was not what the men who had taken the cross had come to do. But pilgrimage access was what the original crusading impulse had been partly about, the right of Christians to travel unmolested to the sites of their faith. Saladin had conceded that right while retaining the sovereignty it had always been attached to. Ascalon's fortifications were demolished as part of the settlement. Richard had rebuilt them during the campaign, and they had given the Crusaders a strong position at the gateway to Egypt. Saladin had insisted on their destruction because Ascalon was the strategic key to the Nile Valley, and a Crusader-held Ascalon threatened Egypt in a way that nothing on the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa could match. This concession cost Richard a significant military asset and gave him nothing in exchange except the treaty itself, which was, under the circumstances, probably worth more than the fortress. The negotiations that produced the treaty had been conducted through intermediaries across the better part of a year, and they had revealed something about both principles that the military record had not. Saladin had held every substantive position consistently, negotiated without visible anxiety, and made no concession he had not already calculated could be afforded. Richard had been brilliant in the field, generous with proposals that collapsed on religious grounds, and ultimately unable to sustain the campaign long enough to change the strategic situation on the ground. The negotiating table, like the battlefield, had ended in a kind of mutual acknowledgement. Saladin returned to Damascus in mid-November 1192 to an arrival that neither man who had just signed the treaty would have predicted from its terms alone. Crowds lined the streets. Poets composed verses in the courtly Arabic tradition, verses that called him the protector who had spread justice over all and rained gifts on his people from the clouds of his generosity and kindness. The Islamic world that had watched the Third Crusade with anxiety received him as a man who had held what mattered, while the greatest Christian army assembled in a generation threw itself against his walls. He had not defeated Richard. He had not been defeated by Richard. In the specific political economy of legitimacy, that outcome was sufficient. But the body that rode into Damascus in November 1192 was not the body that had ridden out of Cairo in 1174. Saladin had spent the better part of 3 decades in the field, in Egypt, in Syria, in the Jazeera, at the siege of Aleppo, at Hattin, at the walls of Jerusalem, across the coastal plain against Richard's column. He had fallen ill repeatedly. He had survived 2 assassination attempts. He had spent years sleeping in tents, managing armies, and sustaining by personal will a coalition that could not sustain itself. The physical cost of all of it was visible to the people around him before the treaty was even signed. He complained of weakness and lassitude. He said he felt like a man waking from a dream. He spent his remaining months in Damascus doing what the war had prevented him from doing, receiving scholars, hearing Quran recitations, and distributing what remained of his treasury. The treasury was not large. He had given away systematically and throughout his reign the wealth that passed through his hands, to scholars, to soldiers, to the poor of the cities he governed, to the ransoms of individuals who had no other recourse. At the time of his death on the 4th of March 1193, a bilious fever having consumed him over 14 days, his possessions amounted to 1 gold piece and 40 pieces of silver. There was not enough to pay for his own funeral. Friends contributed what was needed. The man who had controlled the revenues of Egypt for 2 decades and the treasuries of Syria for nearly as long was buried beneath a wooden sarcophagus covered in a green cloth. The treaty Richard had signed the previous September was a 3-year truce, not a settlement. Both sides understood that the strategic situation it formalized was temporary, a rest, not a resolution. Richard had spoken before sailing of returning. Saladin had made no concession about what would happen when the truce expired. The coast would be contested again. Jerusalem would be contested again. The system Saladin had built to contest it, however, would not be operated by him. It would be operated by his sons, his brothers, his emirs, men who had watched him build it, had served in it, had relied on his presence at the center to hold the competing interests in their proper alignment. Whether they could sustain it without him was the question the treaty year had not answered, because the question had not yet been asked. What the Treaty of Jaffa admitted, if read honestly, was the shape of 2 institutional exhaustions meeting each other across a negotiating table. The Ayyubid machine had been unable, under 3 years of sustained pressure, to expel the Crusaders from the coast. The crusading enterprise had been unable, for the 2nd consecutive major effort, to hold Jerusalem even when it was within reach. Both failures were structural. The coalition army that could not hold the field past the point of a mere consent. The crusading force that could not hold the hinterland without a settled kingdom behind it. The treaty was the moment when both structures acknowledged in legal form what they had been saying in military form for the past 3 years. The war had not ended. The capacity to win it had. Saladin died in Damascus on the 4th of March, 1193, 14 days after the fever began. He was 55 or 56 years old. The physicians tried what they knew, bloodletting, purgatives, and none of it helped. His biographer, Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was with him at the end, recorded the symptoms with the careful attention of a man who understood he was watching history conclude. The sweating, the headaches mounting in intensity, the loss of appetite, the moment when he could no longer sip water, and then the coma from which he did not return. The treasury held 1 gold piece and 40 pieces of silver. There was not enough to pay for the funeral. Friends and officials contributed. He was buried beneath a wooden sarcophagus in the garden outside the Umayyad Mosque, with the simplicity he had always affected and had, in the end, actually earned. He had required before his death that his emirs swear loyalty to his eldest son, Al-Afdal Ali, who held Damascus. His second son, Al-Aziz Uthman, held Egypt. His third son, Az-Zahir Ghazi, held Aleppo. His brother Al-Adil held the northern provinces, the Jazira, Transjordan, Edessa, and Haran. The arrangement had the logic of all Saladin's administrative decisions: family members in the critical positions, mutual obligation maintained through kinship, the personal center replaced by a formal distribution of authority. It also had the flaw that every such arrangement carried. The men who received the territories were not Saladin, and the system had been built to function with Saladin at its center. The Zengids of Mosul attacked within weeks of the funeral. They had been waiting. The Mosul Treaty of 1186 had bound Izz-ad-Din and his successors to supply troops on demand, but that demand had always flowed from a sultan who could enforce it. The Mosul Zengids understood that a dead sultan could enforce nothing. Al-Adil moved north immediately, suppressed the Zengid advance, and turned their attack into a further expansion of Ayyubid territory in the Jazira. He was still Saladin's brother. The machine still ran when the right operator was behind it. The question was whether Al-Adil was the operator the machine had been built for, or simply the last man capable of running it. Within the Ayyubid family itself, the fracture became visible within a year. Al-Afdal, who had been designated overlord of the whole system, lacked the political acumen to enforce a position that had rested on Saladin's personal authority rather than on any codified succession mechanism. Al-Aziz in Egypt and Az-Zahir in Aleppo refused to acknowledge his suzerainty in any practical sense. In 1194, Al-Aziz invaded Syria and marched on Damascus. Al-Adil intervened as mediator and brokered a settlement: Judea to Al-Aziz, Latakia to Az-Zahir, nominal overlordship to Al-Afdal. Nobody was satisfied. The settlement lasted less than 2 years. In 1195, Al-Aziz invaded Syria again. Al-Adil managed the situation again, preserving Al-Afdal's position while making clear that his continued survival depended on Al-Adil's choice. By 1196, Al-Adil had concluded that Al-Afdal was simply incapable of ruling effectively. He shifted his support to Al-Aziz. The combined forces of Al-Aziz and Al-Adil took Damascus and exiled Al-Afdal to Salkhad, a provincial town in southern Syria. The man Saladin had designated as the heir of the unified sultanate was removed from power by his own uncle 3 years after his father died. What happened in 1197 demonstrated how completely the defensive system had dissolved. A fresh wave of Crusaders, not the Third Crusade but its successor, a new contingent from Europe responding to the ongoing call, arrived on the coast and took Beirut and Sidon. Both cities had been held by the Ayyubid system for a decade. Both fell because there was no unified response, because the emirs in the positions of responsibility were watching each other as much as they were watching the Crusaders, and because the machinery for coordinating a multi-front defense required a central authority that had ceased to exist. Al-Aziz died in November 1198, thrown from his horse on a hunting trip near the pyramids at Giza. He was 27 years old. His young son, al-Mansur, became nominal ruler of Egypt under a regency. Al-Afdal, still in exile, was recalled to serve as regent, a final indignity built into the structure of a system that had no settled mechanism for managing the transition between generations. Al-Adil moved against the regency, defeated Al-Afdal at the Battle of Bilbais in January 1200, and on the 17th of February 1200 pronounced himself Sultan, inserting his own name into the Friday khutbah where al-Mansur's had been. The son of Saladin's youngest brother had, 7 years after Saladin's death, absorbed the throne that Saladin had built for his own bloodline. The irony was precise. Al-Adil was the most capable ruler the Ayyubid family produced after Saladin, a skilled diplomat who understood that the system's survival required consolidation rather than conquest, who rebuilt the treasury that the Holy War had emptied, and who promoted trade with the Crusader states on the grounds that economic interdependence was more durable than military victory. He was also the living demonstration that the system Saladin had built could only be held together by a man of Saladin's specific quality of personal authority, and that when such a man died, his successor had to be found not in his children, but in whoever among the available family members could actually do the job. A Zahir of Aleppo submitted to Al-Adil's suzerainty in the spring of 1202. The Ayyubid unity that had taken Saladin 12 years to build and that had dissolved within months of his death was restored, after 7 years of internal war under a man who had not been part of Saladin's designated succession. The restoration was real, but different in character from the original. Al-Adil governed through consolidation and pragmatic diplomacy. He did not invoke jihad as a unifying framework. He did not build the ideological pressure that Saladin had sustained throughout his career. The Ayyubid state survived. The Ayyubid project, as Saladin had conceived it, did not. The Crusader states that Saladin had reduced to a coastal strip began recovering during the years of Ayyubid internal conflict. The truce of 1192 had given them 3 years. The chaos of the succession gave them considerably more. By the time Al-Adil had consolidated enough authority to turn outward, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, reborn as a narrow coastal entity centered on Acre, had acquired new walls, new settlers, and enough structural resilience to function as a state. Saladin had come within a decisive margin of eliminating it entirely. The margin that saved it was the 7 years his heirs spent fighting each other instead of the Crusaders. The scholars who gathered at Saladin's tomb in Damascus in the years after his death composed eulogies that described him in the vocabulary of Islamic heroism. The just ruler, the defender of the faith, the man who had restored what had been lost. The vocabulary was accurate as far as it went. What it did not capture was the specific structural irony of his achievement, that the qualities that made him capable of building the system were the same qualities that made the system impossible to transfer. The personal authority, the exhausting diplomatic attention, the relentless management of competing loyalties. These were not institutional features that could be inherited. They were characteristics of one man. And when that man was gone, the system he had held together by inhabiting its center began, immediately and predictably, to revert to the condition he had spent 20 years correcting. What the dissolution exposed was not the failure of the Ayyubid project, but its nature. It had never been a state in the modern sense, a set of durable institutions capable of operating without reference to who occupied the throne. It had been a personal coalition, a network of family, obligation, equity revenue, and ideological pressure that Saladin had assembled and maintained through the force of his own presence. The madrasas endured, the military culture endured, the administrative practices endured. The coalition did not. The coalition had always been, at its root, one man's relationship with 24 other men. And relationships of that kind do not survive their originator. The Franks returned to the coast. The emirs returned to their local interests. The sons argued over what their father had left them. The structure Saladin had built to make 1187 possible was gone within a decade, and the world it had briefly made, in which a unified Islamic system from Egypt to Mosul faced a fragmented, internally divided crusading presence, had never been anything other than the product of one extraordinary, exhausting, unrepeatable act of will. The legend of Saladin was constructed in the Islamic world within a generation of his death, and constructed with a specific emphasis. The scholars and poets who wrote about him reached for the vocabulary of justice, piety, and the restoration of the faith. They praised the mercy at Jerusalem. They praised the defeat of the Crusaders at Hattin. They praised the return of the Holy City to the prayers of Muslims after nearly 90 years. They did not in the main write about Egypt or the dismantling of the Fatimid Caliphate, or the siege of Aleppo, or the years of patient, costly maneuvering against the princes of his own religion. Those parts of the story were real. They were simply less convenient to the image the legend required. The European legend took a different shape, but reached for equally selective material. Saladin, the noble enemy, the chivalric adversary worthy of Richard. This image was built from the mercy at Jerusalem, the water offered to Guy of Lusignan, the horse sent to Richard at Jaffa. It was an image that served a specific European purpose, a Muslim conqueror who behaved according to the values European knighthood aspired to, could be admired without the admission that he had actually won. The chivalric Saladin was a complement to the crusading ideal even in defeat. It was also a profound misreading of what had made him effective. What made him effective was not mercy. Mercy was an instrument deployed at specific moments for specific political purposes. The mercy at Jerusalem was calculated to a degree of precision that the legend never acknowledges. It produced the reputation that Saladin needed in the Islamic world, demonstrated the superiority of his governance over the massacre of 1199, and enabled the surrender of a city whose garrison was in no position to resist anyway. He was capable of mercy, and he was capable of executing prisoners on a beach and ordering a city quarter burned to break the military cohesion of a regiment he could not afford to leave intact. He used both, and the deciding factor was always the same: which outcome advanced the project. The project was the argument. Saladin believed, and the evidence of his entire career supports the belief as genuine rather than rhetorical, that the Islamic world's failure to expel the Crusaders was structural rather than military. The Crusaders had not survived because they were militarily superior. They had survived because the Islamic world surrounding them was too fractured to concentrate enough force for long enough to destroy them. The solution was unification. The mechanism was the ideology of Sunni revival and jihad. The instrument was the Ayyubid state. Every decision he made from the moment he arrived in Egypt in 1169 to the day he signed the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 was subordinate to this analysis. He was right about the diagnosis. The Crusaders were held in place for 90 years, not by military invincibility, but by the political disorder of the world around them. When that disorder was corrected, when the Fatimid Caliphate was abolished, Syria unified, the Zengid princes absorbed, the coalition assembled and held together long enough to fight at Hattin, the crusading presence in the interior collapsed within weeks. The diagnosis had been correct from the beginning. What the diagnosis could not fix was the cure's dependency on the man who had administered it. The institutional question is the one that separates Saladin from the category of military genius in which the legend tends to place him. Military genius is a personal attribute. It dies with the person who possesses it. What Saladin built in Egypt and Syria was more than military genius. It was a genuine attempt at political architecture, at the construction of a system that would outlast its builder. The madrasas, the Iqta reform, the madrasa endowments, the chancery, the administrative continuity maintained across 3 separate territories. These were institutional choices, not personal ones. They reflected an understanding that the project required more than one man's lifetime. And yet the coalition that the system depended on, the military and political coalition that had to be assembled and held together before any of the institutional work could function, was entirely personal. Saladin could not delegate his authority to hold it because his authority to hold it was not delegable. It resided in the specific quality of relationship he maintained with each of the men in the system, and that quality of relationship was his alone. When he died, there was no mechanism for transferring it. His sons could inherit the title. They could not inherit the relationships. The question the video's opening posed: was the Ayyubid project a genuine institutional achievement, or was it the longest and most consequential act of personal will in medieval Islamic history? Has an answer that is, frustratingly, both. It was a genuine institutional achievement in the sense that the madrasas still stood, the Iqta system still operated, the administrative apparatus still functioned, and the Ayyubid dynasty still controlled Egypt and Syria under Al-Adil for another quarter century. The institutions he built outlasted him by generations. They shaped the region's political and religious culture long after anyone could remember who had built them. But the coalition was will. The specific outcome of 1187, the assembly of a unified military force from Egypt, Syria, the Jazira and Mosul under a single command, capable of meeting the full military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the field and destroying it, required 20 years of personal diplomacy. Sustained by one man's exhausting attention to the competing interests of 24 princes who had no particular reason to subordinate themselves to each other. That outcome could not have been produced by the institutions alone. It was produced by a man working through the institutions, and the difference mattered enormously when the man was gone. There is a further argument that the dissolution makes available, and it is the most uncomfortable one. Saladin's success at Hattin and Jerusalem was so complete and came so quickly after the final assembly of the coalition that it created the impression of inevitability, as if the Islamic world had been building toward 1187 all along, and Saladin was simply the man who delivered what the system had prepared. The dissolution suggests the opposite. The system had not been building toward anything. It had been held in a configuration by one man's will, and when his will was removed, it returned to its natural state, which was fragmentation. 1187 was not the product of a structure. It was the product of Saladin standing inside a structure and preventing it from falling apart long enough to win. This is what separates his achievement from the achievements it is most often compared to. The caliphs of the early Islamic conquests had built institutions that expanded without them. Administrative systems, legal traditions, and theological frameworks that operated across distances no individual could personally manage. What Saladin built was more intimate and more fragile. It required him. The question of whether he understood this about his own project, whether he knew, in the long campaigning seasons of the 1180s, that the system would not survive him, is one the sources cannot definitively answer. But the decisions he made about succession, distributing territories among family members rather than codifying a durable succession mechanism, suggest a man who understood power as a personal rather than an institutional phenomenon, and who built accordingly. The world remembers him for Jerusalem. It is the right thing to remember him for, because Jerusalem was the demonstration, the proof of concept, the outcome that gave the entire project its retrospective justification. But Jerusalem was not his achievement in isolation. It was the last step of a sequence that had begun with a family leaving Tikrit on the night of his birth, had continued through a Kurdish officer's education inside the Zengid military machine, had accelerated through the Egyptian vizierate and the Syrian campaigns and the coalition building, and the decade of waiting for the kingdom of Jerusalem to make its decisive mistake. The mercy at the walls of the city was real. It was also the final product of one of the most systematic and sustained acts of political construction in the medieval world. He died with 1 gold piece and 40 pieces of silver to his name in a city he had governed for nearly 20 years, in the garden of the mosque where the Friday sermon was delivered in the form that acknowledged the faith he had spent his life defending. He had not built an empire that would last. He had built an empire that would win, once, decisively, against the right enemy, at the right moment, and then dissolve back into the competing interests it had temporarily suppressed. Whether that makes his project a triumph or a tragedy depends entirely on what you think political achievement is supposed to be for. He thought he knew. He was probably right. The evidence of everything he built and everything that came apart after him suggests a man who understood exactly what he was doing, exactly what it required, and exactly what it cost.